We're revisiting the Intel i7-7700K today, which came out in January of 2017 for about $340 US. The 7700K was shortly followed by the 8700K, launching later in the same year, but with an additional 2 cores and 4 threads. But if you remember back to that time, not many 8700Ks were available, only a few motherboards were available, and all of them were Z370. So it was a rushed launch, and it was really just after the 7700K. So that was a big gain, and it was one which stacked atop the 7700K's already relatively high overclocking potential for regular 4.9 to maybe 5.0 gigahertz overclocks. This revisit looks at how the 7700K compares to modern Coffee Lake 8000 and 9000 CPUs, alongside modern Ryzen CPUs from the Zen Plus generation. Before that, this video is brought to you by us and the GN Store. One of the best ways to support us and get something in return is to grab an item from the GN Store, like one of our blue beer glasses with a gold halo, featuring the popular Teardown logo, or one of our critically acclaimed mod mats with wiring diagrams and a GPU teardown grid. We also have a brand new black and blue mousepad that many of you requested, now available on the store. We keep selling out of things thanks to you all, but we've been working hard to get it back in stock. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to grab something today. Back when we reviewed the 7700K originally, it was one of those Intel launches where it just wasn't that exciting. And that was sort of common at the time where, it's 4 cores, it's 8 threads, and it's a little bit faster than the previous one. So compared to the 6700K, if you already had a 6700K, it really wasn't worth upgrading. And it was barely worth upgrading from a 4790K or something like that. So it wasn't the most exciting product at launch, but it did overclock fairly well, which has become a bit of a trend with Intel CPUs lately. Now the bigger difference is when the 8700K launched thereafter, because with the 8700K, suddenly you've got a core and thread increase, and now Intel's really starting to feel some competition from AMD. So that's where things got interesting. Unfortunately for 7700K owners who purchased in around January of 2017, it was about 9 months later that the 8700K became available. Even though it was limited in quantity at the time, you can't help but feel a little bit burned by that. It's just a faster launch cycle than is typical. We wanted to then go back to the 7700K and look at how does it do today. If you had waited a little bit longer, how much performance would you have gained instead? So as a refresher, this is a 4-core, 8-thread part. It's hyper-threaded, of course. 4.2 gigahertz base, 4.5 gigahertz boost, and 8 megabytes of total cache. So the cache has gone up as well on modern CPUs, about $340. For comparison, the 9700K, which we just reviewed, although it'll either be on just before or just after this video on our channel, the 9700K, 8 cores, 8 threads instead, and it's 3.6 gigahertz base, 4.9 boost, and then the cache is up to 12 megabytes, and it's about $400 to $420 depending on where you buy it and when you buy it. And we saw some as low as $400 on Newegg, and I think we bought ours for about $430, depending on the time you bought. So it's a price increase. It's still an i7. People felt a bit weird about the 9700K just because it is a part that could be hyper-threaded, but was obviously elected not to be hyper-threaded because you've got the 9900K above that. So there is some product segmentation going on there, which is pretty normal. It's just a matter of, is it really, what do you get for that product segmentation? Is there any benefit to the consumer? So we're going to look at the 7700K, see how it compares to the 9700K, the 9900K, and we've got all the Ryzen numbers in there as well in case you're considering a move to something like the 2700, which would be a bit of a lateral move in gaming, but could be an upgrade in something like Blender for production or 3D tile-based rendering workloads. If you want to check that out as well, it is in this content. So let's get into the testing. F1 2018 uses the Ego engine by Codemasters and places the 7700K stock CPU at 241 FPS average. Still a fully capable performer in this type of game. It is bottlenecking our 2080 Ti, evidently, but performance is still high enough to support most other high-end GPUs without stifling them too much. A 1080 Ti would be a good fit, for instance. This is highly dependent on title, so this positioning may change with other games, and the bottlenecking factor of the high-end GPU will also fluctuate. The stock 7700K is flanked primarily by the preceding Devil's Canyon 4790K at 218 FPS average, and by the succeeding i7-7700K at 248 FPS average. For the 8700K and 7700K, the differences are negligible. It would be difficult to notice a 0.1 millisecond difference in frame time, if not impossible. For Ryzen comparisons, the closest would be the 2700 at 4.2 GHz, which ranks at 212 FPS average and nears the 4790K in performance. A frame time comparison would be apt here as well, enabling us to better look at the performance of frame consistency, or, as some people like to call it, smoothness. The y-axis is frame-to-frame interval, or frame time measured in milliseconds, and the x-axis is the frame count. We want a consistent line with as few deviations from the mean as possible, and when there is a deviation, we want it to be fewer than 8 to 12 milliseconds change frame to frame, as that tends to be about the human perceptual range for frame time consistency, or inconsistency as it were. This plot gets busy fast, but staggering the line reveal helps a bit. The 7700K ends up right around where the 8700K is when both are overclocked to 5.1 and 5.0 GHz respectively. The result is a roughly equivalent frame-to-frame interval with also roughly equivalent frame time spikes when they occur. The spikes never exceed 20 milliseconds for the 7700K, so while there are a few that are noticeable in play, there aren't enough spikes to really mar the experience meaningfully, or at least not meaningfully different from the other CPUs. Every CPU, AMD and Intel, seems to encounter these spikes in this game, making it more likely a function of the engine itself. At 1440p, scaling remains the same, and the 7700K is firmly planted between the 8700K stock CPU and 8600K stock CPU. Overclocking the 7700K puts it just below the 9600K stock CPU, showing limitations of the Kaby Lake architecture and 4-core 8-thread approach. Assassin's Creed Origins gives us a look at a Ubisoft title, something that Far Cry 5 will enable as well once we get to it next. With Assassin's Creed Origins at 1080p medium, the 7700K stock CPU benchmarks at 100 FPS average, which places it just below the 8600K stock CPU's 103 FPS average. Frame time consistency between the two is functionally the same and scales about as you'd expect. The overclocked 1700 at 3.9 GHz is also not too distant from the 7700K, although 0.1% lows begin to dip a bit. As for the 4790K, just for perspective, that's at 86 FPS average and around the performance of a stock 1700, with the Intel i5-2600K at 63 FPS average when stock. Overclocking the 7700K puts it at 107 FPS average, or around the performance of a 5 GHz 8600K. Generationally, the 8700K offers meaningful uplift to 113 FPS average when stock, as compared to 100 FPS average on the stock 7700K. While the 9700K pushes the bar to 127 FPS average stock, we can see that the 9900K pushes it to about 135 FPS average stock. So we've got a pretty staggered stepping there. Far Cry 5 is next and gives us another Ubisoft title with a different underlying engine. At 1080p normal, this one places the 7700K stock CPU at 115 FPS average, or right above the R5-2600 when set to 4.2 GHz. The 7700K at 5.1 GHz lands it between the 8600K stock CPU and 8400 stock CPU, so not that exciting overall for the old 7700K, but still not bad for hanging on. At 1440p, the stack is similar. The 7700K at 5.1 GHz is right around where the 7960X sits, ahead of the 4.2 GHz R5-2600, and behind the stock 8700K by a somewhat meaningful amount. One note here with regards to the i5s though, like the i5-8400 and i5-8600K. We've seen issues with i5s, specifically because of the thread deficit, not because they're i5s, in Far Cry 5. This is something we've talked about in the past, recently even, and something we need to still look into more. But the bigger thing here is that even though there's a bit of a performance lead in some instances, for the average, the frame times might not be better. Something that we can hopefully put on the screen to show you a previous frame time chart illustrating that with one of the other i5 CPUs. And that just comes down to how many threads are available for this game, because it can actually leverage 8 threads if you give them to it. As we always note, Civilization 6 and other grand campaign games are all about turn completion time, or the time required for AI players to figure out their next moves. With multiple AI players in the game, it can take minutes to get back to your next play if on a slow processor, and that becomes annoying for gameplay. The i7-7700K ends up at 12.8 seconds stock, placing it around the same place as the R7-2700 at 4.2 GHz and just behind the 7960X at stock speeds. These two flanking CPUs help illustrate that this game prefers frequency to threads, though it can still make use of both, as illustrated by the 7980XE at the top of the chart. It's just a matter of having enough frequency. With a relatively big overclock to 5.1 gigahertz, at least for the 7700K, the CPU ends up at 12.2 seconds for a turn time reduction of 5% over the stock 7700K. The overclocked result puts it around the 8700K stock CPU at 12.5 seconds and not too distant from the 8600K at 5 gigahertz, which benefits from a few additional physical cores and some architectural advancements. The 9700K performs significantly faster than the stock 7700K at 11.7 seconds for its turn time completion and posts a reduction of 8.6%. For perspective of the product stack shift this generation, the 9900K ends up at 11.4 seconds when at 5.2 gigahertz, a noteworthy reduction over the 7700K. As for how much you notice these changes, that'll depend on how many AI players are present and how complex the turns get. Blender is last, giving us a look at production capabilities of the 7700K as compared to modern CPUs. This is where the 7700K starts to lose its relative staying power shown in other applications, like games, because tile-based renderers like Blender will leverage one thread per tile being drawn. The 7700K stock CPU takes 38 minutes to render the GN monkey heads, or 47 minutes to render the GN logo intro animation. Overclocking the 7700K to 5 gigahertz because 5.1 was unstable and crashing plants it firmly at the performance level of the R5 1600, or close enough to be a fair comparison. The 8600K at 5 GHz holds the lead over the 7700K despite the 2-thread deficit, and the 9700K provides a significant time reduction from 38 minutes on the 7700K stock to 29 minutes on the 9700K. A time reduction of 25% is noticeable in rendering workloads, but Ryzen still does better here at the same price category. For an example, we can highlight the 2700 stock CPU and its 26-minute monkey head render time, or the overclocked variant at 4.2 GHz with a 23-minute completion time. If you're using Blender or other renderers where a new tile is generated for each thread, this is where AMD's CPUs come into play. Chances are that a 7700K owner bought their system before Ryzen came out, so we wanted to highlight what AMD has done well while you've been away. So recapping all those charts, if you overclocked your 7700K, you're still doing pretty well. It's held down okay. Look at a game like F1 2018 where it's not the most intensive game in the world, considering we're in the hundreds of FPS, but it shows that with the right game combination, you're still doing fine with the 7700K. So should you upgrade, it still feels a little bit early in a lot of these titles to do so, but if you really want to spend $500, or, well, I guess you're buying a new motherboard, so you're definitely spending $500, even if you go with the 9700K, then you get a bit of a boost. Yes, absolutely. It's just you really have to evaluate how much does that extra reduction in frame time matter to you. Because for a lot of people, probably not so much, not $500 worth of importance. And maybe waiting a little bit longer, upgrading your GPU would matter instead. Now, if you're getting a 2080 Ti, for example, it would be a good time to upgrade because you're going to be bottlenecked by the CPU, as we saw in these charts. Anywhere in the chart where the 7700K is significantly or meaningfully lower than the top item in that chart, that is the illustration of a CPU bottleneck, and that happens pretty much everywhere. As you move up in resolution, the frequency of that occurring goes down, so like 1440p, suddenly it's not so bad. But I mean, you all know how bottlenecking works. So that's kind of where we look at a potential upgrade. And of course, it all depends on what kind of frame rate you want as well. Some people are more picky about that than others with regard to something like 200 hertz, for example. Either way, though, 7700K is done decently. It hasn't held on in quite the same way that the 2600K has. 2600K is still a really impressive part. It's, considering when it came out, it's a phenomenal performer even today. The 7700K does just fine, and if you haven't overclocked it, it's probably a good time to consider doing so if that's something you feel comfortable with, because it does give you a decent amount of performance in a lot of these titles. But is it worth upgrading? It's kind of a weird, nebulous area to be because it's not that old. January 2017. Most people are probably waiting about another year before they upgrade. On average, it's about a 3-year upgrade cycle for people in the industry. So by that point, you'll have probably Ice Lake or Sunny Cove based CPUs available, which is when we probably push you towards waiting on. But if you really need an upgrade today, it's like always, if you feel like you're being held back by your CPU, if you make money with your computer through work and it's holding you back, then absolutely upgrade because it'll make you more money, more return. Or if you're just an enthusiast and you can't stand not being the best, well, I guess there's nothing we can tell you. But clearly there's been improvement. and the 9900K is a bigger improvement than most, but it's also more expensive. And so for that, we would probably look at waiting maybe another at least 6 months or so before you really consider a serious upgrade. So that's it for this one. Let us know what you've overclocked your 7700K to. Just curious. 5.1 is pretty good for ours, but I know there's higher and lower ones out there. Subscribe for more as always. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to pick up a shirt like this one or one of the mod mats that we have on the table here. And you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. Helps out there as well. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.